Hi, good afternoon. This is Mark Denzler, President and CEO of the Illinois Manufacturers Association. I'm so happy that you can all join us this afternoon for a conversation with Congressman Darin LaHood. Darin represents the 18th Congressional District, kind of in central and kind of heading northwest a little bit, kind of headquartered in and around the Peoria area, getting down in the Springfield area. Darin has been a longtime friend of the IMA and the manufacturing sector from his days in the Springfield legislature and now in Washington, D.C. And we're very happy that Darin has agreed to give us an update about what's going on in Congress with the economic recovery packages and other things that manufacturers are concerned about. And so you can send any questions into ima@ima-net.org. And after Darin gets done talking, we will then answer some of these questions that come in. So with that, Congressman, I know that you're extremely busy. We appreciate everything you're doing and look forward to hearing your update. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate the introduction, and let me acknowledge everybody on the call, and thank you for the opportunity to visit with you a little bit about how the federal government's responding or not responding to the coronavirus pandemic. And what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the number of the pieces of legislation on the federal side that we passed, talk a little bit about the governor's decision yesterday and my frustration with that, and then obviously want to open it up for questions from you that on issues that may be top of mind. Obviously, I know there is a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress in the business world, in the manufacturing world out there of when we're going to get through all of that. I was in D.C. yesterday to pass our fourth piece of legislation as it relates to the response to the coronavirus. It's been analogized that our response is kind of like a baseball game. It's 9 innings, and we're maybe in inning 4 right now. The bill we passed yesterday is the vast majority of the almost $500 billion that we passed yesterday will go to the replenishment of the PPP program, which is, of course, the Paycheck Protection Program run through the Treasury Department and the SBA. That was in the second to last bill we passed, which was the CARES Act. We went through $350 billion in that, which was about 2.5 weeks ago. This is the program that's kind of the lifeline to small businesses. It's the businesses less than 50 employees, but it's the restaurants, it's the bars, it's the landscapers, it's the contractors, it's small manufacturers to get people through this 8-week period of time. It had some glitches at the beginning. There were some deficiencies, but I think in the end, it worked fairly well. Let me just back up. The program, when we drafted it, we wanted it to go to small businesses. Going back to the financial meltdown in 2008, 2009, one of the criticisms then was we gave all the money to the big banks, and the big banks never filtered it down to small businesses or to the small entities. We did that. We reversed it this time. Go to your local lender, whether it's your community bank or your credit union or the bank that you use, and using the portal through SBA and Treasury to get your money. And again, I know there were some problems at the beginning with getting this done, but overall, I think it's been extremely successful. So yesterday, we replenished that fund. And by the way, we changed some language in there. So I'm sure you heard companies like Ruth Chris or Shake Shack or some of these Harvard University. We changed the language in there so that companies like that are large can't get the money, and it goes truly to small businesses. And again, helps people get through this 8-week period of time. If we didn't have this program, you'd have a lot of companies filing for bankruptcy. And so this is really a lifeline for them. We also, in yesterday's bill, passed about $100 billion for hospitals. A lot of those are going to go to rural hospitals. The district that I represent, is fairly rural. I represent Peoria and Bloomington Normal and Springfield and Quincy, Jacksonville. And so it is important that we help our hospitals. Just anecdotally, OSF Hospital based in Peoria in our district has 21,000 employees. They're going to lose $260 million in the second quarter because the hospitals have been empty in downstate. We never had the spike. We never had the coronavirus patients that everyone thought was going to happen. And of course, hospitals in Springfield and Bloomington Normal and Peoria and elsewhere, have had to react accordingly. They haven't been able to do any elective surgery. So So this money is going to help our hospitals get through this period of time. Lastly, we put about $25 billion in there for testing. Obviously, the testing has to be more robust. It has to be more efficient and more effective and more accountable. And so hopefully this $25 billion will help with that. And so, again, as we look ahead in the next stimulus bills, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. I think we have to be responsive to businesses, because depending on what state you're in, if you're still under a shelter in place through the end of May, like Pritzker put in place yesterday, we got to give businesses that flexibility, that discretion to allow them to be nimble with how they spend that money. Because of course, under PPP, once you qualify and you get your money, you have 8 weeks in which to spend that. And again, I think that's tied the hands to a lot of our small businesses. So I serve on the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives. There's been a lot of us on both sides of the aisle that want to free up the ability of SBA and Treasury to give our small businesses some flexibility and ability to get through not only the 8 weeks, but beyond that. And so we're working on that also, which I think can be helpful. Let me just address Governor Pritzker's order yesterday. I was very disappointed and frustrated by his order yesterday. I think we ought to go to a tiered approach, and tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 is obviously a hot spot like Chicago, that we ought to have shelter in place. We ought to have restrictive measures until we get a handle on it. But downstate Illinois, in the district I represent, is much different from Chicago. We actually are much more like Iowa or Missouri or Nebraska than we are Chicago, and ought to be treated accordingly. And there are other governors around the country that are beginning this tiered or phased approach. And that makes a lot more sense to me. Of course, we didn't see that yesterday, but again, our hospitals are empty, and people are becoming restless. They're in a lot of ways becoming angry, and they want some gradual, changes to get us back to normality. And so it's frustrating we haven't had that. I've used the expression, the coronavirus may kill, but poverty is going to kill and cause more problems down the road. And we have to get people back to at least thinking about work and getting a paycheck and getting back to some normality. It's not like a light switch, and I don't pretend that it's going to be that way. But downstate Illinois, we have listened to the health professionals. We have been compliant. We followed the rules from CDC and Illinois Department of Public Health for 6 weeks. And we're going to continue to do that and exercise social distancing. But there has to be a recognition that we are different. And that balance, of course, always listening to health professionals and people in the medical field, we got to listen to them. But there is no scientific data or medical data that I've seen that doesn't cause me to believe that downstate Illinois should open up sooner rather than Chicago. And lastly, 75% of the state of Illinois is farmland. And again, we ought to be treated accordingly. So that has been a frustration for me. I'm going to get on a call with the governor along with some of my other colleagues from downstate to have this conversation with him, to continue to stress to him that they continue to relook at this and hopefully make some changes that would go into effect sooner rather than later, because I think that's the right approach to take. And then lastly, let me just say, as we look out at future bills, there's a lot of talk of what's going to happen. There's talk about infrastructure. What does that mean? I know the president is interested in infrastructure. I don't know if that'll happen in the next bill, but could happen after that. Again, rebuilding our roads and our bridges and all those infrastructure projects that we need to do out there. How large of a bill that's going to be, we're unsure. How you pay for that. There's a lot of ideas on the table right now, but that's one area the Ways and Means Committee is looking at in a way to get people back to work, to get this economy going again. And then finally, obviously finding a cure, a vaccine is top of mind for everybody. And I know the White House task force is working on that. The president's working on that. And that obviously is the ultimate solution, because my sense is, from a district like mine, a lot of people are still going to be hesitant and resistant to getting back to normal until they have sufficient medical proof from our healthcare providers that we're headed in the right direction. So let me just thank everybody on the call for again, dealing with this and getting through this. I want to make sure that the federal government is as responsive as possible with the needs of our manufacturers. You're the backbone of our business community, and we want to make sure we continue to be there for you. So, Mark, with that, I'm happy to take questions or open it up however you want to do it.
Thank you, Darin. I appreciate it. And what I would say on behalf of all of our members across the state and those on the phone call are that I couldn't be more proud of the men and women on manufacturing force today. Every time in our nation's history when there's been a crisis or a challenge, manufacturers have risen to the call, and they're doing it again. And we highlight every week and every day, companies, whether they are car manufacturers that are making ventilators or liquor manufacturers that are making sanitizer, injection molding folks that are making products. And so it's really been an amazing effort by manufacturers up and down the state and across your district who are stepping in this wartime-like effort. And so I appreciate the fact that what you said about manufacturing. It's been very, very, very impressive. I'll just start actually with a couple quick notes of things that we might like considered in Washington, D.C. as well. One, in terms of liability protection, a lot of manufacturers, as I've noted, have retooled their facilities or increased production to respond to this. And I've gotten a lot of questions about liability protection. I know our friends at the National Association of Manufacturers are working to try to get some kind of liability protection. And then the second thing I would just note for you as well, the unemployment insurance benefit that you all passed in Washington, D.C. that provides additional funds. The IMA had a meeting with our Department of Employment Security today, and we looked at some pretty stark numbers, Darin, that we could get to a $14 or $15 billion deficit in the state's unemployment insurance trust fund. I was on a call with all my sister organizations across the country a while ago. So as you look at a different stimulus as well, look at plugging money into state unemployment insurance systems, because otherwise our unemployment insurance tax rates are going to go through the roof. And so those are just two items that I would note for you. And if you have a comment on either, that would be great. But just that you can kind of add to the list for discussion when you're back in Washington, D.C.
Well, Mark, thank you for that. And yes, those are two issues that we've been engaged on, or I've been engaged on. The liability issue I'll take first. Obviously, the transition that many manufacturers have made to helping out with, as you said, ventilators and PPE and masks and all those things, they've stepped up and really been helpful to the effort as it relates to Corona. But I've seen it in the state of Illinois. We have a very aggressive lawyer bar, and you're continuing to see this come up. I know the Workers' Comp Commission made a decision this week in Illinois that again caused me some concern. But the point is, we need to acknowledge through either statutory changes or legislative changes the protection for manufacturers that have helped up and stepped up to be engaged in this process, and prevent them from being sued and going through the liability. That language, we've drafted that. That's ready to go. There's some discussion about whether the administration can administratively put that in place. That there was some flexibility in the CARES Act to do that. But that is, again, top of mind for me and for the White House. And it may be something we have to do in the next piece of legislation, but I think it's something we got to continue to monitor. Secondly, on the unemployment insurance, it's probably the biggest issue we dealt with, not in yesterday's bill, but the last bill, the CARES Act, which is, of course, the largest bill. It was $2.3 trillion. And in there, we of course, plussed up the unemployment insurance system. And you may remember this, Mark. It was the reason why the bill almost didn't pass, because there was a lot of people that said, why are we going to give $600 to a person and disincentivize them from working? And it's a valid argument. It's something that I struggled with at the end, whether to support. But as many people on this call may be aware, when you have 50 different states and you have 50 different unemployment compensation systems, and of course, Illinois, unfortunately, is a very generous system for a lot of reasons. And so, and of course, employers are on the hook for a lot of that. We couldn't figure out a way at the end to structure that. Now, as we look ahead, of course, what we put in there, the money is going to get people through the end of July on unemployment insurance. But I can guarantee you, my Democrat colleagues are going to want to come back and replenish that and put money back in exactly the same way. I think we can't do that. And I've told the Secretary of Treasury, we ought to go to a tiered approach there where maybe you put in numbers where it's $300 a month and you can't go over that, or 400 or 500. But I think we run into real difficulties when we're disincentivizing people from working. And I've heard, and it's been a topic. I was just on a call with NFIB. I've talked to a lot of restaurant owners, and I've talked to a lot of landscape companies and contractors that they can't get their workers to come back because they're disincentivized because of our lucrative unemployment insurance system. And so that we have not fixed that the way we need to. And before we replenish the system again, we have to put, I think, parameters in there so we don't do this again, Mark.
Thank you. One of the questions that came in, and it's been a topic of discussion here for the last couple of days, where Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell talked about allowing states to declare bankruptcy. And then, obviously you're aware of Illinois' fiscal situation, and the governor said no to that. But just kind of comment, someone asked about your opinion of that, about, allowing states to declare bankruptcy, and I think you and some of your colleagues might have written a letter about it, but just your thoughts on that.
Well, listen, people forget. I know this has been a hot topic this week with Mitch McConnell's statement on not wanting to bail out states that haven't exercised fiscal responsibility. Listen, let's remember the numbers with the state of Illinois. We're $140 billion in unfunded liability. $140 billion. We have not been good stewards of the tax dollars in Illinois. I mean, so why would the federal government come in and bail out states that have not been fiscally responsible? I think that's the argument. And there's not a lot of sympathy in Washington, D.C. when you have states like Illinois that for 30 years have not solved their fiscal problems. The answer is always raising taxes and raising taxes and raising taxes. And I know the governor, I disagree with him on this. He has his proposal on the November ballot to go with the progressive income tax. And I don't think that's the right approach. So what McConnell said, and it was controversial because as we look at the next round of stimulus, there is going to be money that we're going to have to allocate to states and cities and municipalities. So my point on that is, let's have the conversation. Do I want Chicago or the state of Illinois to file bankruptcy? Of course not. That wouldn't be good for our state. I wouldn't want that to happen. But we can't keep going down this path where, the federal government's going to come in and give you a big chunk of money and you're not going to have any reforms and not change the way you do things in Illinois. I am not going to support that. So I wrote a letter along with my colleagues to the Democrats in Springfield, to Senator Don Harmon, and said exactly that. We want to help you. We want to partner. We want to give you some money to help you get through this, but not without reforms and changes to the state of Illinois. And I think that's the responsible approach to take. And I think you're going to find that many of us in D.C. that want changes to put Illinois on the track to fiscal responsibility. And having the option to declare bankruptcy, I think, would put the pressure on the state of Illinois to do that. But again, it's a conversation we need to have to moving the state forward, to be to do things in a more fiscally responsible way.
One of the folks sent a question and said thank you for your efforts, and that one of the struggles that they really have are convincing their employees that the workplace is safe. You've had the stay-at-home order, you've had a number, obviously, news stories all over the place, but just the importance of talking and creating a plan, a federal plan and a state plan, that we have some sense of normalcy and kind of a plan to get back. That at this point there doesn't seem to be, kind of a strong federal plan or strong state plans. And just kind of your thoughts generally on how do we reassure the public or reassure workers, or what can we do that to let them know, at some point that it's going to be safe to go back out again?
Yeah, good point, Mark. And I've heard a lot of that too. Obviously, continuing to follow, the basics, right? What the CDC guidelines and the Illinois Department of Public Health as it relates to sanitation, social distancing, and following those guidelines. Those have worked, right? But yeah, I mean, maybe what we're used to in the past, you're not going to be right next to another employee. You're not going to be on the line with somebody. You're gonna be in a different work environment, and obviously PPE plays a big role in that. Masks and gloves and all of those other things, the sanitation that needs to be implemented. I mean, it's going to be a change. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we've heard a lot about what restaurants are going to look at. Maybe it's every other table. So I think it's going to be a gradual approach, and I know that it's something that everybody struggles with on how we do that. But the federal government does play a role in that, and giving out clear guidelines on that. But it's going to be a gradual approach coming back, and I think the federal government, particularly the CDC, I think Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, they got to continue to talk about areas where we've made progress and success on that. And again, ultimately getting to a vaccine, making advancements in medicine is going to be helpful. And lastly, testing. Having the ability to test frequently in a more robust way has to be a part of that. And again, this $25 billion we passed yesterday is going to go to the Abbott test, which I was at a testing facility in Springfield earlier this week that Walgreens is doing. The Abbott test is amazing, but we got to have more of those, and having testing in our manufacturing plants and other businesses is going to help with that also.
That's a great point. One of the questions that has come through, and I think it's more of a state issue, but I'll address it, is the issue of business interruption insurance. A number of companies, it says, have business interruption insurance, but the policies exclude things like pandemics. And so I believe, Darin, that this is a state issue on insurance, but is there any discussion, or have you heard that when you're out in the district about business interruption insurance?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, yes, I have, and this has risen to the White House too. I mean, there's a push to have large insurance companies cover this pandemic, even though it wasn't written into the policy, right? That insurance ought to be there for that. I know that the White House is looking at that, and then at the state level, you're correct. There's also many issues related to the state level on that. You're gonna get insurance companies being very, very resistant to this. But it's a topic that we're looking at, and obviously could have real drastic effects on it. And it comes down to the policies and what's written in there and what was anticipated.
Yeah, and I think that for the listeners, that is one of the issues. Contract law is a pretty well-established principle, in the United States. I know it might have created frustration for companies. A fun question has come in and said, you're sheltering at home. What's a favorite book you've read, or what are you watching on TV?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm doing. Having 3 teenage boys at home that are doing supposed e-learning. I find myself, the only place I can go in the house is I go to the garage, I get in my car, and I lock the door for some serenity. But my wife, who watches a lot more TV than I do, we've watched a number of shows, but she's got me into the Ozark show. So I've watched a few episodes of that, which has been interesting and fun to watch. And then I'm trying to think what the other one, a couple other ones too. And then I'm reading a book on Lincoln, which is, the author is Donald, and it's a lot about, it's a great book, but it's a lot about his formative years in Menard County and Sangamon County and Macon County when he was a surveyor and a young lawyer. And it's a great book that I wouldn't have an opportunity to do otherwise. But I'll just tell you this, my kids want me to go back to work because I think they're sick of having me around the house.
A question that came in, Kristen Jamison, who is in the Jacksonville EDC. Is the federal government working to help 501c6 organizations like EDCs and Chamber of Commerce? They have not had access to PPP. It's something that the IMA has requested. Do you see a way where 501c6 organizations like Chambers of Commerce might have access to the PPP program?
So we tried to address this in the bill yesterday, and we couldn't reach an agreement on it. The difficulty, Mark, on this is, yes, Chambers of Commerce, Convention and Visitors Bureaus, which are structured on 501c3 status, they should receive money. The problem is, there's a lot of country clubs, golf clubs, private clubs across the country that are the same way. and I don't think the intent of the PPP program was to, you're going to get bailing out a country club or Augusta National in Georgia that fall under this category. And so we've been trying legally to figure out a way how you make a distinction between chambers of commerce and convention and visitors bureau that are, again, structured the same way. We weren't able to do that, but there is no doubt as we try to reopen, society and get business back going, the Chamber of Commerce, whether it's in Jacksonville or Peoria, anywhere, plays a big role in that. And we need to make sure that they're not laying off their employees because they're going to be important as we rebuild the economy, and same with the Convention and Visitors Bureau. So we're continuing to work on that. We didn't get it done yesterday, but I'm optimistic we can include them in the next round.
Okay. A couple of similar questions have come in. Chris over at Morton Industries and Tom Wilson talking about the PPP program and specifically when we might get more clarity on loan forgiveness and how that comes about. And then as we kind of talked earlier, and you addressed a little bit about, companies that may get PPP now, but, it's after that 8 weeks if they don't have any customers now. But just really, is there additional guidance finalized or when it will be coming about PPP loan forgiveness? Anything that you can maybe add to that as well?
Yeah. So yesterday, in between our votes, the Small Business Committee met, and there was broad agreement between Republicans and Democrats on exercising this flexibility and discretion, and giving, again, businesses the ability to adapt and change, and again, be flexible. So that was a good sign to me moving forward. And so I think as people continue to work through this 8 weeks, sooner rather than later that we have to do that. We're not scheduled to go back to DC until the first week in May, so it'll be the week after next. I think that will be the time to address this and put some language in place that, again, gives folks the ability to do that. I know this anxiety is going to build between now and when people run out of their 8 weeks of funding. So sooner rather than later so that they can adapt and change, the better. As you might imagine, Mark, when you got lots of different industries, whether you're a car dealer or a contractor or a landscaper or a manufacturer, you gotta adjust depending on how your business is doing or not doing. And again, that flexibility needs to be there. So conversations being had, the language is being put together to change that. And I anticipate when we get back that first week or second week in May, we'll have a legislative vehicle to make that change.
Okay, another question that's come in has to do with the Main Street lending program. Companies have to attest that it will, quote, make a reasonable effort to maintain its payroll and retain its employees during the loan. And the question is, how is that judged or enforced? If you happen to know, I don't know if they're going to ask, I guess, what your employee count is now and maybe at the end, but on the Main Street lending program, do you know how they're going to enforce or judge whether you've maintained your payroll or retained your employees?
Well, I think it's undetermined at this point. However, I mean, you can imagine, Mark, when you have every small business in the country applying for PPP, and how are they going to be able to audit, or how are they going to be able to watch or maintain that? I mean, I think they'll do kind of spot monitoring. Obviously, there are requirements. There's paperwork that needs to be filed in order to meet these, to meet the requirements. How that will be enforced, I think, we just don't have the capability in the federal government to enforce that on every level. But I think that they'll have a way of doing that, and I know the IRS will be involved also. And I know a lot of people are going to accountants to get guidance on that. But the bottom line is we're not going to be able to enforce everything. And I think as we look at changing some of these guidelines and loan forgiveness as a part of this down the road, on the Main Street loan that you talked about, I think that forgiveness is 2 years out. I mean, there's also some talk about, again, flexible and giving discretion the further we go, looking at where companies at 6 months from now or 9 months from now, and giving them the ability to adapt and revise it. So what I would just say is I think some of those things will happen down the road, and And I think there'll be a lot of discretion given to the businesses, and should, until we get back to some normality.
Well, Congressman, we've kind of come to the end at 2:30 here. On behalf of the IMA and our partner organizations and the companies on the call, we want to say thank you for everything that you're doing during this time. Your staff has been fantastic when we've had questions and reached out, and I'll give you the floor for final comments. And, if folks do need to get a hold of you or your staff during this time, maybe let them know the best way to get a hold of your team. But again, thank you, and I'll give you the floor for any final comments you'd like to offer.
Well, Mark, thank you for that. Very good questions. I enjoyed going through those. And again, we're all in this together, and I know many people on the call will continue to have questions. So please feel free to reach out to my staff, to my office, on our website. We want to make sure we're attentive in answering your questions. And then lastly, I would just say this, Mark. Obviously, we are a resilient country. We are a resourceful country. We are a faith-based country. We're going to get through this. There's no doubt, sooner rather than later. But we have to have the government respond accordingly as it relates to, again, giving us the ability to transition back to normality so that we can prosper and thrive. And that ultimately is how we're going to get out of this. So with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be on.
Thank you, Congressman. Be well, and all the best to your family, your staff, and all of your constituents across the district. And that concludes today's call. Everyone be well and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Mark.